Today's distinguished speaker, who has already identified herself personally as well as on the screen, is Professor of Gynecology, Medical Education and Clinical Lead of the Academic Unit of Reproductive and Maternal Medicine at the University of Glasgow. She's an honorary consultant obstetrician and gynecologist for the National Health Service in the UK. She's devoted much of her professional life to improving the health and well-being of midlife women all over the world, but particularly on the Indian subcontinent. She's devoted much of her time to educating others and to encouraging others to follow in her footsteps to try and help the well-being of women worldwide. She's always been interested in evidence-based medicine and remains an active researcher with interests in menopause, hormone therapy, menstrual disorders, and the mechanisms of hot flushing. She was chair of the development group for the 2015 NICE guideline, Menopause Investigation and Management. She is Senior Vice President of the Royal College of Obstetricians, and she is the current President of the International Menopause Society. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our President, Mary Ann Lumsden.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rod, for that very kind introduction. I want to take a slightly different slant on the topic of menopause to start this conference and this presentation. And as we've just heard from Rod, Pieter van Keep is the name that goes with this presentation. And I don't think I'm going to give many prizes for those who will recognize the second person in this picture. And Rod didn't actually mention that Pieter van Keep had been the first editor of Maturitas, which he did with a close colleague and friend who donated me this picture. And thank you very much for that. He also moved on to work in Geneva and later in Oregon. And it's a tremendous honor for me to be asked to give this presentation. Now, I wonder why women have a menopause. What on earth is the reason for it? We're spending a lot of time talking about it, but why is it happening? When you think about the fact that we base much of our philosophy and viewing of nature on the survival of the fittest. So what is there that could possibly contribute to survival in having a menopause? There's competition among species and different members of the same species to survive, and these characteristics must be transmitted to the offspring, suggesting that producing children really is the most critical role of women, and this has always been considered to be the case. And when reproduction is finished, women really cease to have the same role in society. And the women and those best able to compete for resources will survive, and everyone else will perish. So why do women have a menopause? And I want to explore this a bit. And we can see there are some many, many beautiful artistic impressions of the ages of women going through youth, when women are beautiful, into older age, when they're usually depicted, often in this glimpsed picture, as really being far from beautiful, having had this young life. And so for many, it is still seen as a decline, and really something which must be endured. And I want to explore as to whether this is reality. Now, the reason we're all getting so interested in health, well-being in menopause is because of the increase in life expectancy that is so well illustrated here. And there are many, many images that are similar. And this is true, actually, throughout most of the world. And you can see in some areas that women will live maybe on average, 90 years, others rather less. And it's only in 1 or 2 parts of Africa where the lifespan barely extends beyond the reproductive years. And so society is really changing. And as I mentioned earlier, we are likely to spend longer in the menopause when we live in the developed world than we did in the reproductive years. And this is quite a sobering thought. So we need to be prepared for it, we need to think about it, and we need to make the most of it. So what is it? Well, it's one of the more daft definitions in medicine, I think, being a retrospective definition and usually defined as a year after the last period. In Europe, it's about 51. In Asia, it's considered to be somewhat less at 47. And amenorrhea, stopping of the periods, what does it actually mean? And I think when we look at the way the ovary functions, you've got ovulation, corpus luteum formation, preparing the endometrium here for pregnancy. When pregnancy doesn't occur, the endometrium is shed. And so you have a period. Stopping period is, for many, synonymous with having infertility. And for many women and many societies, this is not a good thing. Now, it's a very interesting thing that gonadal development starts very early in embryological life. At 20 weeks, there are 7 million germ cells. However, at birth, there are only 1 or 2 million germ cells remaining. And from there, I'm afraid, it's downhill. And we have this image, which I'm sure will be familiar to most of you, of declining follicle numbers. Here in the 20s, you've got optimum fertility, declining fertility, end of fertility, perimenopause, and menopause. And basically, menopause is reached because the ovary runs out of eggs. It is a very well-defined point in life. And this is associated with hormone changes which characterize the menopause. This is a very simple, very simplified diagram. In the pre-menopause, you've got regular changes in hormones. Perimenopause, it's complete chaos. And the hormones are up and down and all over the place. One day they'll be in the premenopausal range, the next day they'll be in the postmenopausal range. And I think this was why on the NICE guideline we said over the age of 45, really, hormones are not going to be terribly helpful. And the postmenopause, you get back to some stability, or probably a majority of women achieve some stability, at least of their hormones. And these, again, in a very simple stylized diagram, you have declining ovarian reserve, rising FSH, and the markers of the follicle pool are also declining, and this heralds the end of ovarian activity. And when the ovarian cycles cease, they may do it abruptly, or they may do it in a gradual way. But you get decreased fertility and ultimately amenorrhea. And for a majority of women, there are some sort of climacteric symptoms, which we're here discussing, trying to help and trying to sort out. Now, this is something that may be a little bit different for many of you. Is menopause something which, if you like, is a Darwinian abdication? It flies in the face of the survival of the fittest. What is really interesting, at least I found it so, was that menopause occurs only in a very small number of species. I became interested in this area when a colleague, who's actually in human nutrition, bounced into the coffee room and said, "Do you know that orca whales have a menopause?" And I didn't. So I did look into this because it seemed such a curious phenomenon. And also, I will refer again to gall-eating aphids, which I suspect some of you will never have heard of, let alone know anything about. I think there are those who say, oh, no, come on, menopause occurs in many animals if they live long enough. This actually is not the case. They cease to reproduce, but it's not the same thing. They could, but they just don't. And we find, even in the very primitive species, older females will persist in large numbers, even into old age. Now, I want to show you some examples of this. These are the orca whales, killer whales. And if you look at the menopause and the reproductive capability, it ceases at about 50. It's quite interesting that it happens to be very similar to humans. But they will live for a lot longer, post-menopause. There has to be a reason for this. And so that was why I became interested in exploring, from an evolutionary perspective, why on earth this happened. It also happens in another very interesting group, which are the Kung hunter-gatherers, where you again get them living far longer than reproductive function. And I learned about Kung hunter-gatherers about 35 years ago when I first went to Edinburgh, where the head of the MRC, a vet, was studying the breastfeeding patterns and contraceptive efficacy of breastfeeding in this very group, because they birth space, and that is possibly why they live for such a long time. And this is where they come from in Africa. But going back to what I said earlier about species that don't have a true menopause, it's the animals that often live for a very, very long time in captivity that can go on reproducing right up to the end of their life. The offspring may not do so well, but they are capable of producing them. So why on earth should this be the case? Could be lifespan artifact, i.e. we're just living longer, so it's happening. Could be reproductive conflict, mate choice, or grandmother or grandparent hypothesis. And I'll just go through these quickly. Well, lifespan artifact hypothesis explains men. They can go on reproducing up until extreme old age. And you can see, obviously, that the lifespan has changed enormously from early Neolithic times, Roman Empire, where it didn't do to be a slave, through the Middle Ages and into developed countries now. So, you know, you can see why people do think that. And then if we looked at reproductive conflict, I want to come back to the orca whales. These whales have individual markings, as you can see, and they live together in pods, and they're very static in these pods. The calves stay with their mothers. And so the animal behaviorists have been following them for years. And a lot of them actually are found off the coast of British Columbia. So there may be people here who do know more about it than I might expect. But many of the studies have been done with many successive scientists following these animals with extreme detail. And what they've found when we're thinking about reproductive conflict is obviously, as they live together in pods, a female killer whale will become more closely related to others in the pod as she ages, effectively consanguineous relationships. The young females compete with the old females to reproduce, but they probably try a bit harder. And the mortality hazard for the calves from older females is much higher than those from younger. So not so good as they get older. And the costs of co-breeding are greater for old compared with young females. So are there parallels in humans? Of course. If you look at fertility, it declines with age. And you can see the incidence of miscarriage goes up with age. But the next image is the one that is so striking. This is today, and it is around the world. Mortality goes up with age in virtually every environment. And I think this is alarming, and we all need to be focusing on this. And so, yes, there are parallels with nature and humans. Now, I apologize for these pictures, but I couldn't really think of anything sensible to say. I think there are many reasons why men will marry young girls or trade current wife in for younger model or whatever. I'm sure there are equally a number of reasons why young women will marry very much older men. But I thought I wouldn't really explore that in too much depth because it's pretty obvious. But men are, as I mentioned earlier, able to reproduce to the end of their life. And they will potentially want, if they want to have more and more offspring, to have younger wives in order to be able to do so. But I think, actually, the grandmother hypothesis is very interesting, and the reasons for that may become more apparent in a few minutes. But it provides a means for development of a menopause phenotype, if you like, and it also brings me back to these gall-forming social aphids. And it works because, in the main, blood is thicker than water, and throughout nature, the kin of whatever species will share food, provide resources, care for each other in a way they may not with other species or people outside their family. And the reason why this is such an interesting insect, and I can't imagine actually why I came across it, but when it ceases to be able to reproduce, the gonads degenerate and produce a very sticky, toxic substance, which is then used to defend the nest. And so this allows the young to develop and be successful. And I thought that was really quite interesting, and you can see so many parallels in nature. And we find, going back to the Kung hunter-gatherers, that the older women are particularly good at foraging for food. They help the survival of their families and for their offspring to do well. Now, we also know that there are an increasing number of grandparents claiming national insurance credits in the UK now, as I speak, because they're looking after grandchildren while their daughters or sons go out to work. And so this is quite an interesting area. And there are other reasons why people quite enjoy their grandparenting. And this is my first grandson, born 5 weeks ago. So I thought I had to get that picture in somehow. But it is a very exciting time. And the nurturing and caring side of it is very important. But it is not the only thing. And I think this is the most important part of this. The studies of orca whales that have been undertaken have shown that the post-reproductive females lead the pods. And what they do is they spend time at the front of the pod, and when food is scarce, they will take the pod to find the food. And so they are leaders, they are absolutely vital to the survival of the species, and I think are quite an interesting lesson for all of us. But I want to move on really to think about leading and how one can promote the ability of women to have the sort of old age they want. By 2050, there will be over 1 billion women aged over 50. I mean, this is incredible. So it's really something that is important. And the profile of the population is changing. This is what it was like in 1950, where the population was predominantly young. And this is what it's like now. And these are the India and the UK, just because of the different population sizes. It's true everywhere except sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there are different views of the menopause, and this was in a newspaper about 3 weeks ago. And this unfortunate gentleman, Mr. Ben Broadbent, who is Deputy Chairman of the Bank of England, likened the UK economy to be having a menopausal moment. And in the article, and this is a direct quote, he said that menopausal women are past their peak and no longer so potent. You can imagine the reaction of a lot of people. I would love to have known what his wife's reaction was. But one comment, which I thought was rather beautiful from another financier, a woman in her late 50s, was, I don't think it's a menopausal moment, I think it's andropausal. So I thought that was quite good. But that is one view of the menopause, and that, I think, is pretty awful. But what sort of old age do you want the women here or the women you know for the men here? Do you want to be really active? Do you want to serve others and carry on working into extreme old age? Or will you be content to have a rather sadder menopause and old age, or give in to disability? And I think this is really what it's about. We've got to enable people. And one of the reasons we have to enable people to live the lives they want is because of the cost of care of the elderly. And this is a US figures showing what it costs for people to live in nursing facilities, at home with help, and in attending daycare. And you can see this compared with the average family income. It is hugely expensive. And the reason why it's so expensive is because of the numbers of chronic health conditions, non-infective disease. And this goes up significantly with age, and it goes up more in women than men. And this is 3+ chronic conditions. And these are conditions which limit daily activity. So this is really quite alarming. And we've heard a few minutes ago about some of the social determinants of health. And you can see this is the UK, and going from the south to the north, the life expectancy is completely different. If you live in Winchester, it's 85.9. If you live in some parts of Glasgow, where I happen to work, it's 78.5. Huge difference, and some of the reasons for that I'll show you in a minute, so keep this image in mind. But the other thing that many people do during their older years, menopausal years, is they care for other people. And this is true, again, throughout the world, and it's a very important role for most at some stage of their life, going into the menopausal years, and some for a very long time. But the family unit, which has cared so much for older people in many communities, is changing. And I was very interested recently at the college. I proposed a fellow who lived not only with his parents, but with his parents-in-law as well, all together in a family unit. But we were talking about it, and he was saying, for many, this is changing. And so you're getting a lot of elderly poor in India who have to rely on charity to be looked after. And so we have to prepare people. We've got to make sure that they are healthy. And what are they going to die of? What is the disease that will affect them? This has not changed at all, and that is ischemic heart disease. And we have cerebrovascular disease, we have diabetes going up by alarming levels. And so we have this huge global burden of disease, which, it will be no surprise, of course, is absolutely influenced by these socio-demographic factors. So when we look at heart disease, and this was why I wanted you to remember that last map, was because heart disease mimics socioeconomic status. And again, we have Glasgow, which is awful. And we have a real problem with heart disease and social deprivation. So, can we do anything about it? Yes, we can. There are various features which everybody here will know about, which, if corrected, makes a huge difference to the likelihood of having and dying of heart disease. And obviously, there is this nightmare of obesity, and it is a real problem. It causes everything that is bad, I think it would be fair to say. You've got heart disease, you've got arthritis, which means people have less opportunity to exercise, increases cancer, increases menopausal symptoms, increases stroke, etc. So it is really bad news, obesity, and my goodness, I hope others have more success than I do in my clinic at trying to get people to lose weight. What happens at the menopause? And there are some very nice data that come from the SWAN study, which, for those not familiar, is a very elegant, longitudinal, multi-ethnic study, which is based, everything is based around the time of the menopause. And so these are post-menopause, these are pre-menopause. And you can see that things go down from here. This is increase in weight as people age. Interestingly, not a huge direct change at menopause. So if we look at this more closely, okay, we all put on weight with age, and I think most people would recognize this happens. And they always say they're getting fatter. Your body fat doesn't really change, but my goodness, does the visceral adipose tissue, the fat around the organs, the toxic fat, that goes up with the menopause. And so we need to explain this to patients. It's very easy to assess by simply measuring their waist, the size of the waist, and maybe measuring your own and seeing how it changes as time goes on, to get an assessment of what the body fat is doing. And it is bad news. So this is something we need to try and do to educate our patients. There are many data which suggest that the adiposity measurements are related to heart disease risk factors. This is, in fact, CVD events and BMI, which are data from one of my ex-PhD students, Martina Ilidrimiti, in 2017. And this is another paper which was published very recently, showing menopause has a huge influence on the likelihood of having heart disease. And the earlier the menopause, the more likely you are to have heart disease. And we know that those who smoke, and often those who are deprived, may go through menopause early. Other factors, very common factors, are adversely affected by the menopause, and it may be possible to reverse those, as we know. And I think this is a very old slide, but it has huge impact. And what it shows is, if you get the blood pressure under control and decrease it by a small amount, you make a huge difference to stroke and coronary artery disease. And there were some very much more beautiful slides shown this morning which show exactly the same thing. So if you find that your patients have increased blood pressure, even if it's only very slight, don't ignore it and say, oh, it's just because you come to the clinic. Make sure that you follow it up. And if it needs treating, it must be treated. And these are more data, again, from Martina, which show changes through the menopause. Nothing very significant, no change in energy intake. But I think we could be forgiven for thinking, and again, I suspect many of us experiencing, that physical activity tends to decline, and in a big group, it might actually be significant. And so we must let people know that diet and exercise are key to good health. And really, if we don't get that message across, we're letting people down. But there are specific issues. And I think any of us who've had mothers, sisters, friends with osteoporosis know that this is not a joke. And osteoporosis, this is a picture of two women of apparently the same age and how different it is. And this will cause many problems, and one of them, of course, is an increase in the incidence of hip fractures. And this is the incidence per 100,000 women per year, and it's true of all ethnic groups. And what you need to bear in mind is that if you have a hip fracture, you have a 20% chance of dying within the next year to 2 years, and you have an 80% chance of decreased mobility. And so this is a really significant disease. And it is one that we can do something about. We should be advising on diet, exercise, calcium, vitamin D, people doing as much as they possibly can to improve their general health. And the other thing, of course, is that MHT is a very, very useful way of decreasing osteoporosis. And there are many, many studies which show this to be the case. And this is a very old slide, but I always like to show it because it shows the impact of MHT on bone mineral content, which is a surrogate for hip fracture and bone density. And you can see how well the hormones maintain it. Placebo decreases. Here we have placebo decreasing and improved with hormones. And so it is potentially a very important way of preventing an awful problem. Estrogen has rather less impact than combined HRT because the progestogen has an effect of its own. And this is a very clear meta-analysis which shows that most studies will show benefit for HRT. Possibly even more alarming and frightening is the prospect of dementia, and I'm not going to talk very much about it. We have risk factors, genetics, vascular metabolic, lifestyle, that we can show in this image that's taken from a review that I quote the reference for in the next slide. But can dementia be prevented? Well, genetics, you can't change the genetics, but by identifying predisposing conditions, you may be able to help with prevention. And then you've got other aspects which we probably can modify. And you feel that there is very few advantages to high work complexity, mentally stimulating activity, but I'm glad to have found one anyway. And also, we're allowed to have a little bit of alcohol. And here, in this review, they do recommend MHT as a possible means of prevention of dementia. The data for that, I think, are fairly controversial, but it is something which is interesting. So does MHT have a place? And this slide was showed much earlier on. Basically, we know heart disease is likely to be reduced when women start their MHT at around the age of 50. And also the same may be true for dementia. But I liked the idea of pushing this window open to look at the opportunity for health prevention, health education and prevention of disease in this group of women. We know that really the long-term outcomes of hormones are pretty good. And interestingly, WHI shows this clear benefit of estrogen alone on breast cancer, no effect on mortality for anything else. But we have to look beyond hormones. This is only relevant for a relatively small number of women around the world. And this was the guideline that was referred to earlier. And we've had other documents, fairly high-profile documents within the UK, looking at health in older women. It is beginning to get onto the map and receive some attention generally. And what we need to do is to help women help themselves to have a better experience of menopause where possible. We need to support women going through the menopause. And the third area, which is getting a lot of exposure in the UK, is actually helping make things easier in the workplace for women, which really is an important thing. So women can carry on working well past the menopause and really enjoy it and be accepted for all they have to offer. Now, you will have seen in all these slides that there are three logos here: the university, IMS, and the RCOG. And I think I wanted to put all three because I think we have to work together. We have to work together to try and make things better for women. And for reasons that were beyond my and anyone else's control, my friends and colleagues from the RCOG couldn't be here because of a clash of commitments which was insoluble. But I do have a short video lasting a minute or so, just with a little message about the importance.
Good afternoon, and the warmest of greetings from London to you, Marianne, and all of the delegates attending the International Menopause Society in Vancouver. My name's Professor Leslie Regan. I'm President of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Firstly, I'd like to say how sorry I am not to be with you today, as are all my Vice President colleagues, but particularly Professor Janice Reimer, an active researcher in this area, and Mr. Eddie Morris, who is the former chair of the British Menopause Society. I was really delighted to read that one of the themes of this Congress is the importance of a life course approach to women's health, and that you are focusing on the promotion of good health, well-being, and the prevention of ill health, instead of merely providing treatment options for established disease. Adopting a life course approach also provides the opportunity to respond appropriately to current demographic challenges, and we know that the life expectancy of women has increased significantly. The current reality is that most women of my generation will need to plan for the fact that they're likely to spend a longer proportion of their lives in a post-reproductive state than they did in their reproductive era. And we all want to spend those years in the best state of health possible. So your theme of promoting healthy ageing is really very warmly welcomed. The RCOG is an organisation with a wide international reach. Half of our 16,000 members are based outside of the UK. The network of our service users who make up the Women's Network and the British Menopause Society are working in close collaboration with international societies to help improve the clinical care of women and also their patient experience. We're always delighted when international societies wish to work with us, since we have much in common, and the synergy of collaborative working always brings with it mutual benefits, not least of which is the opportunity of reaching and educating more women. I know that the International Menopause Society has a membership that stretches to every corner of the world, and I truly believe we can achieve more by working together. So may I wish you a very successful Congress, and I look forward to hearing more about the highlights and what the RCOG can contribute to this crucial area of women's healthcare on your return to London, Marianne. Thank you.
So, fortunately or unfortunately, we can't all look like this. But I think what I'd be trying to say is that much of the means of living into healthy middle and old age is in our hands. And we must help women decide what is right for them and also do this for ourselves and actually go for it. And we as healthcare professionals must work together to help the women in our countries to live life to the full. And so before I finish, I just want to thank everybody who've helped contribute to the success of my time in office as chair of IMS, particularly IMS staff, Lee and Martin, the board, the executive, Sue and Rod and Steve and Sunila, and we are all working together with other members of the board the RCOG, and finally, I want to thank and acknowledge my colleagues and friends from Glasgow, and it's wonderful to have you here, and also from elsewhere in Scotland, the UK, and around the world. So thank you for coming, and thank you for listening.